maybe be objective about it, right? And also that way you get to meet new people. And what is even the point of these in-person things? It's to meet new people. So, we're going to talk about playing cards specifically, but only a little tiny bit, right? So mostly what I want to talk about will apply to any kind of divination at all, right? And I think everything I will say will apply to any kind of cartomancy, right? So I'm going to start off by talking about what I think divination is. I believe that divination, right, is any method you use to answer questions, to come to know things that you did not previously know for yourself or someone else, but I mean, more properly for someone else, in the sense that like a very tight, I don't mean proper like you shouldn't do it, I just mean like divination qua divination is a thing we do on behalf of others. You can also do it for yourself. But my experience is that for most of us when we read for ourselves, we're actually sort of veering away from divination and into sort of an internal contemplative practice, which is great, but not necessarily like divination, right? Which is one of the reasons I encourage you to work with strangers, because I think it puts you very firmly in that divination camp. And I think it's a lot easier to learn what you're doing in that space and then bring it back to your private practice, right? Because when you're only doing it for yourself or people you're very close to, it's hard to get a handle on how much of what you're doing is stuff that you knew by some kind of supernatural method and how much of it is, I got opinions about your life, my friend, and let me put some cards on the table and then tell you what I think you should do, and the cards are maybe just a mask for me telling you what I thought you should do, right? So, right, and I think that's important to focus on that sort of like delos, right? The root word of divination is divine, right? It's a thing we do in consultation with and in service to, and as allies with the spirit world, right? Like that's essentially where the knowledge is coming from. That's what makes it divination, right? Is its relationship to the divine, to delos, right? To spirits outside of ourselves, right? So I find, I teach a lot of divination. I had an empty side, like I had an empty sheet on my handouts, so you will see an advertisement for my divination class, but really I just didn't want to give you a blank paper. Yeah, so handouts and cards for everybody. Right, and so I teach a lot, right, and I find that where beginners, right, but also experienced people, sort of the lowest hanging fruit for improving your divination practice is asking better questions, right, like framing the questions better. And that's partly because the type of divination you choose, right, relates to how we develop questions, right? So broadly, you can separate divination into sort of two categories, right? Sortilege methods, like cards or runes, or anything else where the answer is effectively multiple choice, right? There's some fixed, relatively small, finite number of options that you shuffle together and pick out a selection. All of those methods are called sortilege, and most of the time in our culture when we talk about sortilege, we're usually talking about cards, but many, many other options, right? And then we have these other sort of what I think of as like free-form methods, which are a little bit more hinging on like direct mediumship, right? And so that's things like scrying. You look into a crystal ball, some images appear, and you relate them, right? At the end of the day, right, those free-form methods are basically you close your eyes, open your mouth, and then the truth comes out. And I will tell you my experience of it is it feels like you're making it up while you're doing it, and then it just happens to be spooky accurate, right? We're not going to talk so much about that today, but broadly, I encourage you to always be mixing those methods together. When we're doing sortilege, so like why would you choose sortilege over those kind of free-form methods? The most common reason is because it provides a buffer. Like real talk, I don't always want to be all up in the other person's psychic miasma, digging around with my words. Sometimes I want a little bit of a like table full of cards in between us to do that heavy lifting. Both because, you know, doing sort of direct mediumship for someone, it's actually very intimate. You're all up in their mind, digging through their psychic basement. You know what I'm saying? We don't always want to do that. When amount of that for you, right? But as you build a relationship with your tools, right, they can carry more and more of that burden for you, right? But again, the key place to make these gains is in asking better questions, right? So that's really what I want to focus on today, and that's true for mediumship, but it's much more true for sortilege, because I remind you that all sortilege methods, you are actually only ever asking multiple choice questions, right? Playing cards, runes, tarot, all sortilege methods, they have very limited vocabulary that they have to use to answer your question, and you need to keep that in mind when you ask the questions, right? And like there are certain kinds of questions that just do better. So something I see in my personal reading practice is people ask things that aren't even questions. They just describe a situation and then they're like, but that's not a question, right? And like you can't actually interpret, you will never get a clear answer to something that is not a clear question, right? So clarity, specificity is like the first thing I want you to think about. This is in your notes, by the way. Like the first thing I want you to think about when you think about what makes a good question. It's that it's clear, right? It's specific. If you don't feel like you can ask a specific question, it means that your question is too vague, right? Big, complicated questions, you should break them into a series of smaller questions, right? But an individual question, well-formed, it starts with like who, what, why, where, when, right? A question. How, I guess I forgot how. Right? The next thing you want to think about, right, is specificity. The next thing you want to think about is answerability. Some questions do not have answers, right? Particularly questions about long-term forecasting. What's going to happen to me in 10 years? That question does not have a determined answer. Like that, at least, like, I don't want to put my beliefs about the world on you, but I am of the opinion, and I believe most people are of the opinion, like, your destiny is not fully fixed, right? So, like, we can predict what's going to happen to you next week, next month. The more specifics we give, the further you can push that out, right? But many questions are simply not answerable, right? Questions about the future, but also many other kinds of questions, right? And one kind of question that doesn't have an answer is any question of the form, should I? Should I do this? Should I do that? That question doesn't have a fixed answer. It has a subjective answer, right? And there's nothing wrong with asking subjective questions, but you need to specify who you are asking, right? So I imagine this circumstance, like you're looking for a new home, you've narrowed it down to like 3 apartments, and your question is, which one should I rent? Well, it depends who you ask, right? So if you ask your ancestors, they're going to be like, oh, you should pick that one on 3rd Street that's right next to your mother. Maybe good, maybe bad, that's their opinion, right? If you ask Aphrodite, she's going to be like, oh, you should take that one on Avenue B. The guy who lives next door is really hot, right? And like, right, so there's this question, if you ask Jupiter, he's probably going to tell you to pick like the most fiscally sensible option, right? But none of those are the singular answer to that question, right? And so for subjective questions, I generally think the best thing to do is specify who you're asking, including like your own subconscious, right? Like for that apartment one, here is my favorite kind of divination for subjective questions. Narrow it down to 2 options. Ask yourself, dear subconscious, option A is heads, option B is tails. Flip a coin, and then before you look at the coin, in your heart, you're wishing, like you're like, come on heads, don't even look at the coin, just pick heads. That I really mean it, like, right? Because at the end of the day, those kind of questions, when what you're really interrogating is yourself, like, I think that prompts an answer actually better than like tarot cards do, right? And I also think importantly, when you help someone frame their own questions, right? So I think that when you're reading for someone else, and sometimes, honestly, your most important role, more important than the magic that gets the right cards on the table, more important than the interpretation, is helping them sort of achieve clarity about what their questions actually are. Right? So if you look here, I need you, it's on the back of the spreadsheet, you will see a little list, right, about qualities that I think good questions have. So we already talked about the fact that they're specific, that they're clear, that they're answerable. This next one, useful. That's what I'm saying, right? The answer you are getting out of your divination should be a piece of information that you use to make a decision, right? And if it does not, if your question, if it's not clear to you what you're going to do with the answer to that question, bad question. I mean, do whatever you want. There's nothing wrong with, look, I'm not going to lie. It's not like I've never, in my youth, just sat there, loves me not, flipping cards. But, like, it's, that can be fun. Like, that's a fun game, and I encourage you to have fun with divination as well. But at the end of the day, when it is a divine act, it has to be about acquiring, coming to know, capital K, know, things you did not know before, and using those to inform decisions. Right? And then interesting. If you don't care about the answer to that question, I don't know why you're asking. But I am 100% confident that people ask questions they don't care about the answers to because they get the answer and then they completely ignore it. Right? So again, good questions are specific, clear, interesting, useful, and answerable. Right? So now, I'm going to bring up some bad questions and talk about how to make them better. Then I'm going to split you guys into groups, right? So we're going to do a couple together. I'm going to split you guys into groups, and you're going to do it for each other, right? So I gave you some playing cards to read with because I want you to do some reading exercises. If you have, like, tarot cards, if you have some other sortilege method on your person, you are welcome to use that. How many people here already, like, know how to read? Like, you have a method that you use for reading playing cards? Okay. And how many people here read tarot? Okay, so I'm going to say a couple things. If you read playing cards already, go with your own method instead of mine, right? Mine is a relatively traditional sort of American folk method, but I know many, many methods, and they are not all the same, right? So like the Three of Cups won't necessarily mean the same thing on my table as you learned, but you can't, sometimes I see people who see what cards are down and then choose how they're going to interpret them. It's like a little bit cheating, but it's also like, it's not a magic 8-ball, right? Like you yourself bring that conduit to the divine to the work, right? And if you're not doing that, you might as well just be flipping a coin or asking a magic 8-ball. Both of which are still inside the proper realm of divination, right? So your first option for reading playing cards is to read them exactly as if they are the pips in a tarot deck, right? So real quick, right, the suits each have an association. So hearts are the same as cups. They generally associate with water, right? With the emotions, with relationships, like romantic relationships, but in playing cards in particular, more often family relationships, right? Diamonds, right, are coins or discs, right? They almost always talk about money. Sometimes they talk about physical health or like your physical home, right? So like if your house is going to burn down, probably you're going to get some diamonds cards in relationship to that. Oh, gosh. So, sorry, I did cups and diamonds. Okay, spades, right? A spade is a tool, right? Like a sword, right? Spades are like swords, right? In playing cards, spades are rarely a good card. Spades tend to be about sort of conflict and bad luck, but that's not 100% the case, right? Clubs are a weapon. You hit people with them like a wand, right? They're about fire. They are often about sex. They're often about conflict. They can be about right? 1 is a number about unity. 2 is a number about parity. 3, just like 3 points to find a plane, is a number about like breaking into a new dimension. 4 is a super stable number. 5 is like a hand that reaches out and grabs things. 6 is like a perfect, beautiful, balanced number. You're just gonna have to believe me, 6s are beautiful. 7s, right, are one step over beautiful, right? So everything was nice, it was perfect. Whoop, a little bit too much, right? Flowing over. 8 is a new kind of stability. It's sort of a future-looking stability, right? 9s are all of the even numbers in some sense are going to be about balance, and all of the odd numbers in some sense are going to be about being out of balance. But out of balance isn't necessarily bad. It just means like it's a less stable configuration, right? And then 10 is sort of the perfection of each number. In playing cards, jacks tend to be young people, but young doesn't necessarily mean like, they can also be young in the sense of inexperienced or disempowered, right? Queens and kings are usually, but not always, gendered, and they are generally people who are older or more powerful in the particular situation at hand. It is not always the case that queens are women and kings are men, but broadly that is usually the case. But you know, a king is sometimes a lady who is in a masculine role for whatever that means. In very old playing card methods, you'll see a lot of talk about how the suits sometimes talk about skin color and race. I find those not very effective in today's world. I think that they are perhaps more relevant in a society where somebody's skin color is 100% dictating which of those social roles they can fill, right? But if you read older books on playing cards, particularly older American books on playing cards, you'll see a lot of that. And those books are almost always written by people of color who are talking about it like in terms of how their community relates to an external, right? Any questions about anything I have said before I start a new example? Okay. So we're going to look at some bad questions, right? And then we're going to try and reframe them. So these are all questions that I see in my professional divination practice very frequently, and that they're all terrible questions. So the first question is, what does the universe want me to know? Well, I assure you, the universe has already told you everything it wants you to know. It manufactured the entirety of the circumstance you are in, trying to tell you. It has nothing else to say. It is spending every moment telling you everything it can all the time. Like, that question is not clear, it is not specific, it is not answerable. I guess it's subjective in as much as the universe is a thing one could consider a subject that like has a unique voice, which I'm skeptical about, right? Its answer is definitely not useful, because if it was, you already knew everything it answers. And I guess it's interesting, but again, that question can only provide answers you already know, right? So when somebody asks that, right, what are some ways to help guide them to a better version of that question? Anybody want to try? There are some on the sheet, so you could just cheat. Okay, so let's address the first question, right? That the universe is an inappropriate thing to be asking a question of. What are some better options? Say that again? A specific God is an excellent question. Jesus, please set me a sign is in fact a better question than universe, what are you trying to tell me? Now, in my opinion, I'm disinclined to listen to that guy's advice, right? But you can tell me any God. But when you know the God is, just like I was saying before, that like Aphrodite has a point of view. And so when you ask her, you're going to get an answer from her, right? So you want to think about, like, of people, including gods, with whom you have a relationship, right? And address a specific one, right? And that's sometimes tricky, because usually you need one that, like, the reader and the querent share, right? Like, I will try and channel gods I don't. There are very few gods who I will like, nope, I won't talk to that person. There are some, but not many, right? But I think generally you're better off finding someone where you agree. So, excellent answer. Any more options? Okay, so some other options are you can ask your own unconscious, right? their interests, right? So a question like, should I have another child? Ancestors are a great place to go for that answer, but again, they have biases, right? If I asked my grandma for advice, I already knew what she was going to say. You know, like, and that's not bad, right? And that's why I advocate asking like a variety of people. Right? Does that all make sense? Okay. Right? Another option would be to clarify the question in the other way, right? So like, what do I need to know about, and then a real specific situation. In particular for those, I like to do a kind of reading that is called a SWOT analysis, right? That they teach in business school. And it's 4 cards: strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. Right? So what do I need to know going into this situation? These 4 things. Strength and weaknesses are things inside you that you're bringing to the conversation. Right? And then opportunities and threats are things outside of you in the situation. Right? So that's a good option for that kind of question. Right? The next, okay, and we're sort of moving to the next. What should I do about this situation? Right? If you are addressing a specific person, that's not a terrible question, but it's still better if you can be more specific, right? So instead of asking what you should do, think about what information you need to make a decision, right? What will happen if here's a plan, right? You can compare and contrast plans. I like that a lot. I do a lot of pro-con lists, right? So like I'll be like, all right, here is the course of action I am proposing. Dear Tarot, dear playing cards, please make me a pro-con list. Here are the pros of this situation, here are the cons. I usually pull 3 for each list, but it depends on the complexity of the question. Right? I'm a big believer, I really like spreads that are like diagrams. Those are my favorite kind. Right? So another kind of diagram I really like is a timeline. Right? Because I think for me, I find timing questions some of the hardest questions to read. Right? So I always say, like, can you please make me a timeline of this situation, right? And you really want to think about the scale on your timeline, right? So if somebody's asking about their love life, they probably don't want to know what's going to happen in the next 3 days, right? But they also don't necessarily ask in 20 years. What kind of scale, right? So what's going to happen this week, this month, the rest of this year, next year, long term, right? Timeline, right? That's another kind I really like. Okay, I want to talk about this specific question because it's what I hear a lot, and that is, who cursed me? Now, I bring curses professionally, like that is a question I am prepared to answer for some people, but it's almost always a bad question because I'll tell you, my experience is that people who ask that question, most of them are not cursed. And the ones who are, they always think they know who cursed them, and they are always wrong. Among other reasons, because anyone who can curse even remotely decently will cover their tracks, right? So instead, for that question in particular, and questions of that type, what I really want to ask is, like, first, like, describe these symptoms, that make you think you are cursed, right? And I'll tell you, about half the time, you list that and you're like, oh, this isn't a curse. I have made very bad choices, and these are the natural results of, like, I have cursed myself with my own poor decision making, right? So some signs of a curse really are, like, other people should look at that list and they'll be like, oh, yeah, you're fucking cursed. Like anybody, if you make a list of reasons you're cursed and other people look at it, everybody should be like, oh, yeah, this is highly unlikely and terrible, right? And repeated, and it sort of forms a pattern around specific things. But for what we call crossed conditions, right? Some bad stuff is happening. I would like to know why. That's what I think you're better off asking. So there's the 3 cards. What is the true nature of the situation? Why is it happening? How can it be improved? What, why, how? That's sort of my go-to reading for all those, right? And it gives you, this is what I'm saying about take a big situation, break it into pieces, and then based on the results of those questions, right, you maybe have some other questions. Does anybody have any questions about anything I have said? Awesome, so we've got just about half an hour left. I'm going to split you guys into partners, and there are some exercises comes out of it. And then I want the reader to guide that person through reframing the question. Well, like, what if we ask this? What if we ask that, right? And then I want you to switch. And then, if there is time, I would like you to read on those questions, right?